Everybody, I hope you are doing well and you're staying safe and healthy and your family is doing well. I know things are really chaotic right now, but I'm so excited to show you these Halloween painting designs because I just absolutely love Halloween. I love fall in general and the changing of the seasons. So it'll be really fun to do this painting class today. This is also a great opportunity with the designs that we have in front of us to customize them the way that you'd like. So with your little sign, you can add whatever saying or name on there that you'd like. You can change the shape of your jack-o'-lantern if you decide to create one of these types of shapes. And there's just so many other little things that you can do to really make it your own. So I'm going to follow these examples closely today, but you are welcome to change them however your brain is directing you to go with your piece. I'm sure it'll turn out into a really beautiful design. So unfortunately, I don't have this one as an original anymore. I gave this to a friend recently, so I just have a printout of it, but we'll still be able to use it for our second piece. And then I did a little bit of prep work just so you didn't have to watch me paint the background 2 times in a row. So this will be used for my other design. And there's only a few things that you're going to need on hand. So if you bought the supplies through the website, you should have everything you need. But if you haven't done that, I'll just quickly walk you through what you might want to have on hand while you're painting. So I'm just going to set these aside for a second. And for part of my design, I'm just going to use canvas board just to show you the 2 options. And canvas board is great whenever you're practicing and you don't want to spend a lot of money on supplies. So it's just like a hardboard that's stretched with a canvas texture on top. So I'll use that for part of my design. If you ordered through the website, you have stretched canvas with the wooden frame. You'll also need a variety of brushes. So I have most of these from the kit that I sell online, but you're welcome to use whatever brushes you have. So some of these I'll be using today, but I just want to show you how to use some of these brushes if you're not comfortable with them yet, and ways that you can go about creating your design with these different types. I also have a large flat brush that I'm going to use. Now this is just a cheap one that I got at the works, but this works really well if you're trying to cover a lot of backgrounds and you're wanting to just get it done quickly. So usually the width of the brush can play into how those lines come out. And so I'm going to use that one just to speed up the process on camera. But if you don't have that, you're welcome to use the filbert brush that I have here. It's just the number 12 with the rounded edge to it. If you add a good bit of paint on the end and just take your time going through the process of the background, it should turn out exactly the same. It'll just take you a little bit longer. I also have a pencil on hand for when I'm sketching out my designs. So we can use that. You can also use chalk if you prefer, or a colored pencil, really whatever you have on hand. So it doesn't have to be anything specific. You'll also want some paper towels and a cup of water for rinsing your brushes. And then my paper plate looks a little bit messy just because I was just doing my backgrounds, but I'll walk you through the colors that I'm using really quick. So I have white, black, phthalo blue. If you have primary blue or a different blue color, you can always use that as well. Some cadmium yellow and some cadmium red. So I'll be mixing these 3 colors here to create our backgrounds, and I'll show you that step in just a minute. But if you don't have these exact colors, no worries. You can always use whatever you have on hand. The different tint of the color might just be slightly different. So it might be slightly warmer or cooler when you're working with your greens and blues, but it should turn out to still be a really beautiful painting. So the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to use my largest brush that I have. And typically I like to just run my hands through the bristles, especially if you just bought brand new brushes, because there's nothing worse than picking little bristles out of your canvas when you're trying to paint. So I just always like to run my hands through that and make sure that everything is good. And then I always like to soften the bristles by adding a little bit of water to it. So I'll just stir it in my water and then just press off any of the excess on the side of my cup. And this softens, again, the bristles, but it also adds a little bit of water to our acrylic paints. And that's typically what you want to do anyway, because acrylic paints out of the tube tend to be really thick paints. So to assist it along like these large areas and to give you more control, it always helps to just have a tiny bit of water within your brush. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use some of my blue, and we're just going to mix it together on the canvas. That way it'll create that kind of unblended, stripy look to it. So I'm going to start with this, and you can see this phthalo blue is quite bright. And I'm just using really long brush strokes here. I'm not trying to, cover big globs of paint on the texture of my canvas. I just want to make sure that the white of my canvas isn't showing. Now, while this is still damp, you can dip into your yellow a little bit and blend some of that together to create a nice, really deep green, almost like an emerald green color. And then what I also like to do is I'll add a tiny bit of white at times, just to give it a little bit more lightness, because we're going to be using mostly black paint on our design. So we want to make sure that our background isn't too dark where we're not seeing all those details in the foreground. And then what I also like to do is I'll have a lighter hands and go over areas if I want to blend them together a little bit more. So I'm usually only using the very end of my brush when I do that part. But to create more of that stripy effect, you can always add a little bit more yellow or blue in areas. And this is where you can just work in sections. So you're not trying to, cover the whole canvas at once, especially if you're using a slightly smaller brush. So just take your time with it. There's no hurry, get yourself a little cup of coffee or tea and just enjoy the painting process. Again, I'm going to add a little bit of white in areas just to break that up. And I'm trying to use like the length of my arm, that motion, just so I'm, assisting that brush from running all the way from the top to the bottom of the canvas. That way you're not, fighting the brush. If you feel like you're kind of holding it tight, just loosen up a little bit, and then you can create more of that flowing motion with your brush strokes. I don't know how much you paint or anything, so I don't want to assume anything. That seems really straightforward to say, but even sometimes when I'm painting, if I'm really focused, I'll tighten up really on my brush, and then I'll feel it later with my hands where it starts like cramping up. So, just keep it loose. You're good. So usually I just work in these little sections. If I want to blend them together slightly, I'll just kind of move over about a half an inch or so and then back in that other general direction. And again, I'm leaving part of these unblended just to create some type of texture in the background. But you are welcome to change it up however you'd like. Because most likely you're probably being drawn to a certain color out of these. So if that's what you like, just go forward with it. And just add some white here or there just to brighten that up. And it's much easier to create this type of blend while these colors are damp. That way they can blend together seamlessly. It's much easier to do that on like a colder day or with just a little bit more paint. So if you find yourself kind of struggling, you'll have something like this happen. Typically what happens with this is that there's two things. You either don't have enough paint on your brush, which is a really easy fix, or sometimes you do have a lot of paint and it's still not wanting to go in these little crevices or texture of your canvas. So if that happens, you can just dip your brush just a tiny bit in your water. And then with that extra water, you can press that into your canvas a little bit better. And canvas board is traditionally a little bit more textured than stretched canvas at times, especially if it's cheaper. So sometimes it helps just to have that little bit of water added to your brush. And this also is important if you're painting on like a hot or a humid day. Sometimes if it's stormy outside or just finished raining, your paints are going to want to act a little bit different. So sometimes you just need to assist it with a tiny bit more water. But typically you can just fix that issue by adding a little bit more paint on your brush. Oops, it's moving on me. And you can add some yellow to create some really vibrant greens if you'd like. Keeps moving. This usually is easier to do as well if it's like flat on the table. That way you can use the whole length of your arm in the process. However, you know, some people like to use an easel with this process too, so it's completely up to you. Now my canvas board doesn't have edges to it really, other than that tiny border around it. So sometimes you'll get like little globs of paint on those sections. So I'm just going to make sure that that's all cleared up. And then once I have everything the way that I want, I'm just going to clean off my brush really well and set it aside. It usually only takes a few minutes for it to dry. But I wanted to show you with my other board, if you're using canvas, it's going to be a little bit different. So let me switch that up. Now, if you have canvas, you usually have an edge to it. So while your paint is still damp and you're mixing it fresh, it's easier for you to go around these borders around the edge of your canvas with that mixed paint. That way, you know, acrylics tend to dry a little bit darker, so they're very difficult to create that same color again while you're working later on. So it's easier just to go ahead and do this part if you choose to do it. I know some people will just leave it as it is, which is also fine, or they'll go in with a different color like a black or like a gray tone. But if you know that you're going to frame it, you also don't need to do this part just because that frame is going to cover over these edges. But it does make it look a little bit more complete if you do this process and then just let it sit a little bit longer before we work on that next step. So I just want to show that to you. And I already did this one again, just so we can speed up that process. But sometimes, you know, when you're adding in these details and things, you can turn your brush to the sharp edge and then create some lines that way if you're interested. And that usually turns out really nice. And typically you'll know when your canvas is dry because it'll have more of a matte finish to it. So, you know, if you are wanting to speed up this process a little bit, go ahead and grab your hair dryer or a fan, anything to kind of get that moisture out of your canvas quickly. And usually only need to hit it for like a minute or two at the most to dry out your acrylic paints. But I know for me, sometimes, especially when we're working on these details, and let's say you want to change something and you need to paint over it, just use your hairdryer to speed up that process. So then you're not working over and over again on something that just needs a little bit more time to dry. So if you need to, you can pause the video at this point and complete your background and wait for it to dry either naturally or with the hairdryer. I'm going to go ahead and move forward so you know the next step. So I have two designs here. I'm going to start with this one just because this is a really simple design. And again, make sure your canvas is dry. It's an important one. And you'll notice with your design here that you can change up this pumpkin shape however you'd like. So we're only going to focus on this general shape here, and then we'll start filling in those details later. If you want to add some more details, I'll show you how to create the spider web and the trees, even that little spider that's sitting up there. So I'm going to take my pencil and I'm going to start sketching out my design. So I usually start with just a basic shape, so like a little circle. And pumpkins tend to have, you know, pieces to them. So to make a more natural looking pumpkin, what you can do is create little segments running down it. You're seeing right here, to create a more natural looking shape. You can make it more of like a lumpy pumpkin if you want, since they come in a variety of styles. It could be taller or shorter. Doesn't really matter, just whatever you think is best. So if you want, you can look at a reference image, which is always helpful. Or if you have a pumpkin in your house for fall or Halloween, you can just work from life, and that's even better. But overall, we're just looking for more of an oval shape for it. And then we can add in the stem. And since this is a silhouette, we're not really looking for heavy detail or anything. We just want to make sure that there's room for our jack-o'-lantern if you decide to put in a face for it. So you can see right here how there's an emphasis of those little segments that I just drew in, just to let you know that it is round and not just like a flat cutout. But overall, again, we're just looking for this overall large shape. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and sketch that into my design really quick. And you probably won't be able to see it with this dark background, so that's why I showed you that other section. But you can have it going off the page if you'd like. I'll try and make it a little bit darker in case you do want to see it. Again, you can make it a little bit lumpier. Whatever your mind is telling you to do. What I also like to do is anywhere where I know that that stem is going to be, I'll curve down slightly. Like if you could see that right here, to give the emphasis of that section of the stem of the pumpkin. Oh yeah, you can see that, nice. And then if you'd like, you can add in your stem really quick. I always like to have a little angle on it just to make it look like there's a little bit more happening with it. And even your stem can be a little bit, you know, lumpy, or add a little bit of wiggly lines to it to make it look more organic, because typically in nature, there's hardly any straight or perfect lines. So if you have like a natural shake to your hand or anything, especially when we get to our tree branches, it's going to be perfect. Now from here, you can decide where you want your jack-o'-lantern face or the shape that you want for it. We can sketch that in. So I'm just going to stick closely to the original. And you can be loose with this because, you know, we're going to paint over all of this anyway. So this is just a guideline for you for where our design is coming in. And these little preliminary sketches also help because once we start adding in that black paint, it can be difficult to paint over it. It sometimes takes a few coats of paint. So if you can get it kind of close to what you want in the beginning, it goes a lot faster. For the smile, I'll just add, just to start as a little reference, I'll just work on the outline of it. I won't focus on these little teeth or anything. So I'll just create this open mouth shape here. You see there's like that smiley face going on right now. Almost looks like a sideways crescent moon. But you can again create whatever kind of expression that you want for your jack-o'-lantern and just have fun with it, because you can always change it up if your original design changes as you're working. I'm not going to worry so much about the teeth right now because I know that I can paint that in with the black paint later. What I'm really looking for is where I need to put my oranges and red colors. So you can see right here, we're going to mix this orange tone out of our red and yellow and just have a pop of this lighter orange to create that shadow that goes around the cutouts of the jack-o'-lantern. But we're not going to so much worry about this black paint here, because if you're trying to create this perfect shape in the beginning, it's probably not going to go exactly how you want unless you use a really delicate hand. So we're just going to only fill this entire section in. Hopefully that makes sense. But if you want to, you can complete it as you go. Now from there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a slightly smaller brush. This is where this angled brush comes in handy. It's the it's the 3/8 brush with that angle to the side. Or you can use, if you're working on a smaller piece, you can use this number 6 flat if that helps, or your number 6 round if you're trying to get into these tight corners. I like to use this one because you can use that sharp edge of it if you need to create those detail lines, and then you can use the broad edge to fill in areas. So this is a really good all-purpose brush. So I'm going to dip it in my water just to create a little bit of that moisture that we need for it. I see a loose hair, so I want it out before I start painting. There we go. And I'm going to take a little bit of my yellow and a little bit of my red to create more of like a deep orange. It's a deep red orange that we're looking for. That way when we do our detail in our lighter orange, that really pops out against it. Okay, so you're going to mix enough just to cover these little sections of our pumpkin. And again, it doesn't need to be perfect. I'm going to add just a little bit of white to it because that is slightly more transparent than it should be. There we go. And again, I'm not really focused too much on the perfection of that line because we're going to go back in with our black paint. So sometimes I'll go just slightly outside of that line to give myself just a little bit more wiggle room so my eyes when I'm working don't get too small. Then we're going to do the same thing around this mouth shape here. Add just a little bit more white to that mixture. So we have to go over a pretty dark color. If needed, you can always do a second layer after it dries, which always looks really nice. So I'm gonna let that sit and dry really quick, and then I might do a second layer just because that is a little bit more transparent. Like I said, these are slightly different paints than I originally used. I think the other ones are a little bit more heavy body, but there's nothing wrong with that. We'll just either hit that with a hairdryer if you'd like, if you want to do a second layer, or just wait another minute for that to dry. Now, while we're waiting on this, we can think about what we want to add for this top section of our painting. So you can have part of a tree branch poking through along here. And so I'll follow this one pretty closely, but we'll add those details in for our spider web and spider in just a minute. But we know that this whole section is going to be filled in with black paints. So we can leave this while it dries and work on the upper half of our painting. And while we're doing this, we want to make sure that, especially with our black paint, when we're doing more of these spindly type of branches, that we're not just working straight out of the tube. Typically, acrylic paint is very thick when it comes out, so we want to have a little bit more control over these more flowy lines. And to do that, we'll just add a little bit more water to our paint. So I'm going to take a scoop of this and just set it to the side right here. And then I'm going to dip in my water and add a little bit of water off my brush to this mixture. And what we're looking for is more of an inky consistency where we don't have like a big glob of paint like this on the end. So if I'm using a round brush, I'll just spin it slightly, and that will get rid of any of those big clumps of paint. And you're looking for like this in between where it feels like the consistency of ink, but it's not so watered down that it's transparent. But typically I can tell if I spin my brush and I don't have a lot of globs of paint on the end, that's pretty good. Okay. And I'm using quite a large brush for this. This is the number 12 round. And I'm only using this to create these larger lines here. And then I'll switch to a slightly smaller one. So to do this, you can go in two directions. Sometimes people will start from the base of the tree like here, and then slowly lift away from the canvas. Or if you prefer, you can start from the end of your branch and press down a little bit harder to create a thicker branch. So I'll start with this one up here and just show you what I mean. So if I start from the ends of my branch that's going off of my paper right here, I'll have my brush where just like the tip of it is mostly touching the canvas. And then I'm going to slowly pull it towards me and then press down a little bit harder. And you can see I'm kind of wiggling my hand a little bit more than normal to create a more natural looking shape. So if that feels comfortable to you, you can always use that motion. And the thing that you want to look for is that your tree branch should never really be the same width from the larger base of it down to the end of the branch. Usually it'll taper off on the ends. So this looks almost like the same line. So what I'll do is I'm just going to thicken up the base of this branch a little bit more to make it look more natural. Okay. Or if you want to work in the opposite way, which I tend to do, but I don't know if it's just because I'm left-handed or what, I'll hold my brush a little bit further away from me in the opposite direction, and I'll start pressing down a little bit harder if you can see that, and then slowly lifting my brush away from the canvas until it's only reaching the very end. So again, work with the way that you prefer. And then typically anywhere where a tree branch is connecting to another one, it tends to be a little bit wider. So I'll just widen that up slightly. If you want, you can have part of the tree going in this section here to make it look like it's connecting to a larger shape, which is what I did for my original one. So I'll just stick to that. I'm just going to bring that all the way down. Okay. And so from there, I'm going to clean off my brush because I'm going to show you how to use a slightly smaller brush to create our other tree branches. So I'm going to switch to my number 6 round, add a little bit of water on the end of it. Make sure I load it up with our diluted black paints. And then I'm going to focus on just these smaller branches down here. So I know that it's going to split right here. So I can start by creating a wiggly little line. And this is obviously a little bit too small, so I can thicken up part of that branch where it tapers off to the end. And if you want to make it look more spooky or Halloweeny, you can have more jagged branches where it's almost like zigzagging effects throughout it. Okay, I'm going to split this one. Where I'm tapering it off in sections. And this looks a little strange here, so I need to fix this. Okay. I'm going to also add some other little branches right along here. So they don't have to be exactly like this one. You can move them around however you'd like. You can have them splitting in sections if you'd like. Again, just think about how they're connected. So right here, I know that this branch is overlapping in this section here, so we can thicken that up a little bit. And then if I need to, if my branch like width of my line looks a little too similar, I just need to have sections where it's a little bit thicker so it creates that tapered effect. And I'm just going to create a few more lines going down. And I'm doing this kind of quickly just to show you that process, but you're welcome to take your time. So again, when you're doing your branches, wiggle your hand a little bit more. If you have a natural shake, go ahead and just go with the flow with it, because it's going to, again, create a more natural looking line. And I'm going to leave this open right here because I want to add in this little spider web later. Now it's not standing out yet because we haven't added any of these highlight lines with our white. We'll do that at the very end of our painting. But if you need to, this is where you can make any edits to your tree branches. Just one little extra one kind of swooping in right there just to fill that space. I'm not in love with this section right here. I need to find a way to fix that. It's because it looks a little odd. I think I just need to bend this a little bit right here. Yeah, that looks better. Okay. Now down here, this should be pretty dry now. So I'm going to go ahead and clean off my brush. I'm going to set it on my paper towel because I don't want my brush just sitting in my water, especially these pointed brushes, because they'll eventually bend permanently while they sit in the water. And I'm just going to go back in with a little bit of this color just to brighten that up. So I'm just going to use a little bit of my yellow and my red and a tiny bit of white just to make it slightly more opaque. Oh, that's perfect. Yeah, that's going to cover nicely now. It just needed a second layer. Again, I'm not so worried about that perfect shape because I'm just giving myself slightly more room for when I add in my detail lines. Okay. And see how big a difference that is between those two colors now. We really needed that. And a little bit of white. You don't want too much white, also it'll be like more of a peachy tone. Just enough to cover that background. Make this slightly more reddish too. I want that really heavy glow coming from my pumpkin. Okay. So again, give yourself a little bit more room, especially if you're adding teeth or anything. You can bring that smile down a tiny bit more. Okay. And that looks really good. So I'm going to clean off my brush. And then this is where you can choose which brush you want to use for the rest of your pumpkin design. So we're going to start filling in the black around these areas and just letting this sit and dry just a tiny bit longer. This is also letting this upper half dry a little longer as well. But we're just going to focus on the outline of our pumpkin. So again, you can use a variety of brushes if you want. You can use this angled brush here, which works really well. I'm just going to start with my number 12 brush because I tend to flock towards this one. And we're going to stick to that same diluted black paint. So if you need to mix more of that, go ahead and do that. And then I'm just going to focus on the outline of my pumpkin. So this is again where you can kind of wiggle your hand a little bit if you want to create more of like a lumpy pumpkin or a more natural looking shape. I don't mind that that is going into this section right here because we're going to have a little highlight line in white. You can also have it going off the page down here if you really want to fill in this section. It just depends on like the shape that you created. I'm just going to fill up close to that line that we put in, but I'm not trying to go into those little shapes yet. And you should be able to go over any texture that's on your canvas quite easily with this diluted paint. And then just fill that in. And with it diluted slightly, it might be just a tiny bit transparent in spots, which is fine. We can always go over that with the second coat. It's much easier to work on it that way instead of trying to put on like a giant glob of paint in the beginning. You always want to give yourself a little bit of control over your brush, unless you're doing something really abstracted. I'm just going to go ahead and fill this in too. And this is almost dry already. And again, if you need to, give it a little bit more time or hit it with the hairdryer. Okay. And then if you'd like, this is where you can also, if it's dry, which, oops, it's not dry, you can go around those edges and clean those up. Mine clearly needs a little bit of time. But while that's working, I'm going to switch to my number 6 round. And this is where I can start adding in some of my other details. So I have my little spider web right here and my spider. You can always add in something else if you'd like. And with the spider and spider web, it is just to show you some of these steps. Typically a spider web will have like a certain point if you're working from a corner. So you can have things radiating from this point as lines. And then what'll happen is we're going to have these little arches that are connecting those lines together. So you always want them going in the opposite direction, like that. If you have another spider web, usually it'll have like another central point too, and you can have things radiating from it or intersecting like that if you're doing a different type of spider web. And then again, we have those little arches that come from it. Just like that. So you can pick and choose how you want to create your spider web. Okay. You can always do smaller ones if you really want to emphasize that radial appearance to it. Now with the spider itself, it's also really simplified. So if I wanted to, I'm going to create the more like the abdomen of the spider here, and then a smaller circle. And then I just have 8 little legs coming from that section. So usually I'll have like 3 on each side for the body, and then 2 towards the front. And then you can have a little string that it hangs down at. So we're not trying to do heavy detail or anything. You could always use a reference photo if you want something more detailed, but that's pretty much all I'm going to do for this one. And you can arch that a little bit more if you want it to have more spindly legs. Okay. So I'm going to create my little spider web right here. Again, I'm using my number 6 round. If I need to, I'll add a little bit of water to it. And then I'm going to go back into this diluted paint. I'm starting to run low on it, so I'll have to mix more in just a second. So again, you can spin your brush if you feel like you have any sort of big lumps or anything, or globs of paint on the end of your brush. That's always really helpful. And then from here, just like this design, you can see it's coming from this point. So we're going to have a few lines that are leading up to this one point here. So I'm using just the tip of my brush to create this line. So if you keep it more at a vertical angle, if it's flat on the canvas, or if you have it on an easel, you just want the end of your brush touching your canvas. Now, if you angle it any different way, it's going to make a wider line. But in this case, we're not looking for any sort of heavy realism or anything. It's just meant to be a fun painting. So if it does have wider lines or anything, that's fine. So I'll just have a few radiating from that point that reach down to my pumpkin. Maybe I'll do one more like that. And then again, you can make those little arch shapes. So just take your time with this point. You can make as many of these little shapes as you'd like. I always like to curve them a little bit more dramatic as they get towards the top of this point here. And then eventually you're going to run out of room, so I just leave that as it is. Okay. And then I also have this little area for my spider right here. So I'm just going to add a little circle, slightly more oval shaped here. A little circle for the head of the spider. A line that connects it to the tree. Load up my brush again. And then I'm going to create the legs. So again, these legs are these little V shapes that are coming from the side of the body. So I'll usually have 3 coming from that section. If you can see that okay. And then I'll have 2 that are closer to the head, just so it looks like it's reaching down like that. All right. So now this should be mostly dry, hopefully. If not, we'll hit it with the hair dryer. And I'm just going to stick to using the same brush just because I feel like I have a good amount of control with it. But you might be kind of leaning towards one of these other brushes. This angled brush again comes in handy for creating those sharp lines if you need it, and then those broad strokes. I'm going to mix up a little bit more of my diluted black. And then I'm going to start really going in and cleaning up these lines right here. So I know exactly where the eyes of my pumpkin are. Now I just give myself a tiny bit more room here because as you notice here, you want a little bit of space to create this lighter area. So if you go really tiny with your eyes here in the beginning, you might not have room for these other little details. Okay, so we're gonna go back in and clean up these lines. Again, leave yourself a little bit of extra room. Okay. And then we're just going to focus on cleaning up the outer edge of our little smiley face here. If you're creating one with little teeth and stuff. Again, leave yourself a little bit of room. You can always touch it up later. Okay, and we're using that watered down paint, so it should be very simple to go over these spots. Now, if you need to, you can work a little bit slower and you can always section it out into smaller little circles or little angles. Sometimes it helps if you need to, you can flip it upside down so you can see where you need to make any little changes or anything. I know that helps me a lot. Okay. That looks really good. So from here, if you want, you can add in some little sections for teeth. If you need to, you can draw those in first. I'm just going to quickly paint in the outline of mine. What I like to do is follow this little smile here. So my line right here will be slightly angled, just to emphasize that this is a round shape. Again, just take your time with this part. I know these are like little details, so if you're not used to holding a smaller brush and stuff, just work in little sections and you should be fine. I'm gonna quickly fill that in. Oops. Make it slightly bigger if you need to. Okay. I'm gonna add a few little teeth on the bottom row too. Again, we're following that shape of that curve. And it's those little tiny details that I think really make up a more natural looking design. So don't be afraid to play with little changes and things because you can always paint over it after it dries. So even if you make a mistake or what you consider a mistake, you can always fix it with acrylics. That's really the beauty of this medium. Make a big tooth right here. And if I want it to be close to this one, I had some that are curved inward slightly just to make it look a little bit more handmade. So instead, I'm like following that upper shape if I wanted to. Okay. That looks really good. Okay. So from there, we're gonna let this sit and dry a little bit. Up here, most of this looks pretty dry, so I can show you how to add in some of those highlighted areas, which really make everything pop forward. So right now, everything's looking kind of flat. So I'm gonna clean off this brush really well because I wanna make sure I don't have any black paint on it at all. So it'll just turn into a gray color when I'm trying to add in my details. And in this case, we're not trying to water down our paint. We want to make sure that our white is nice and opaque. So you can see right here where we're going to add in those details. And this is what's going to, again, bring these trees forward and any sort of lines that we originally put down for our branches. So if some of your branches, like what I have here and here, are starting to blend into your painting, this is where you can make them pop forward. So I'm just going to be using the very end of my brush. So I'm going to load it up with a good amount of paint. And I'm going to just start on this tree branch right here and bring this forward. So I'm just going to focus on one side of it. And I'm going to have that going down over my pumpkin, just to show that it's breaking up that space a little bit. I also had this branch here, so I like to start with the ones that I know for sure I want to bring forward. You can add some little other detail lines. Another really fun thing you can do is you can look for areas where there's these really sharp moments, right? Where there's a heavy curve or a sharp mark that you want to emphasize. So if you use your brush, let's say right along here where there's this big dip in my branch, that creates this illusion of movement and roundness to your piece. So it's all these like little tiny details that you add in that really make everything come together. So I'm just going to add a few other little areas that are popping out. You can also, like if you had really curved lines, this is where you can make them a little bit more jaggedy, for lack of a better word, where you can really just curve your hand a little bit to make it look a little bit more like a spooky branch. So don't be afraid to, go bold with this part of your project. I have this little arch right here. I want to emphasize that. We're also going to do that over here with the rest of our tree branches. So I'm just focusing on the top part of the branch, where it would be like a highlight from the moon in the background. We don't have the moon in our piece, but you can imagine that the moonlight is creating this tiny glistening effect through the tree branches. And I'm again just using the edge of my brush. Okay. We're also going to do that on part of our spider. You can see how there's just the tiniest amount of a highlight in those sections. So again, just keep loading up your brush. I'm gonna add a tiny highlight to that line where it's coming down the tree, and then over part of the legs, just to make them stand out from the background. So I'm barely touching the canvas. So you can use your smallest brush here. Now I do have an even smaller brush that you can use. This is the number 0 round. So if you really want that for your highlights and this feels too big, go ahead and switch to that one. Okay. And I'm also just going to emphasize the shape of the body. I'm going to do a little curve here and here, just to make it look like there's some sort of reflection off of the spider's body. We'll also add a little bit along the spider web to make it stand out. Just on parts of it. We're not trying to cover over all of the other details that we just did. It's just bringing it forward. You can also have it on part of the little curved shapes in your spider web if they need to come forward as well. I just think that looks really good. Okay. This is still a little bit damp here, but we can add in some of our other details once they're ready. So you can see right along here, just to create the illusion of roundness for our little stem of our pumpkin, we can add a little line there. We can create this segmented look where we have these lines curving down. So I'm just going to hold that up so you can see what I'm doing. Okay. I also have it overlapping right here, so I'm just going to bring that forward a little bit where it's overlapping the tree. And then to make it look more round, I can add just a few little highlights around part of the pumpkin. Whatever shape that you had it in originally. So if it has like a lumpiness to it or anything, you can bring that forward. Okay. So the black is almost dry, but what we can do is I'm going to clean off my brush. We're going to focus on these lighter orange areas. So we're almost done with our piece, if you can believe it. Those little highlights really did wonders for it. So right along here, you can see where we have these little lighter areas to create that cutout shape where it looks more three-dimensional. So I'm going to mix my mostly yellow with a tiny bit of red and a tiny bit of white. So it just needs to be lighter than the color that you already have on your canvas. And I'm using the same brush here, so you just want to make sure that it's nice and clean. Or you can use a different brush if you'd like. I'm going to take a glob of my yellow, tiny bit of red, and that's already a close color. So I'm just going to add a tiny bit of white just to make sure it's opaque. It'll be slightly peachier, which will be fine for this step. And my paints are drying up slightly, but they should be okay. So I'm going to add just the tiniest bit of water to mine. You probably won't have to do that for yours, but there we go. And then I'm just going to go in on the side of my little eye holes here. So it's okay if it goes over into the black. For some reason, you can always touch it up with the black later. I'm just going to put it in so you can see where these lines are. Okay. I'm also going to have a little bit going along this bottom edge here. And this is also where if you needed, like this one eye hole is a little bit bigger than this one, it doesn't really bother me, just it makes it look more like a different jack-o'-lantern. But if you needed to, you can always go back in with your black paint after it dries and touch up any areas that you want. But I don't mind some of those little imperfections and stuff because it does make it look more like a homemade jack-o'-lantern then. So I'm going to add a little bit more along here, just to again create that illusion of that little wedge that's created when you cut out a pumpkin. It also adds just another highlight on your piece. It creates that glowy effect for your pumpkin. It's really fun. If you need to, you can always add a little bit more yellow in areas if you really want that to stand out. And then I'm just going to add a tiny bit along the bottom, just because I think it needs something right there. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. So then after that dries, again, you're welcome to clean up any edges or anything that you don't like on your piece. I'm going to leave mine as it is just to show you the next step. But if you need to do that process, just make sure it completely dries before you do your highlights around your pumpkin. So we're almost done. We're just going to add a little bit of white around the eyes and around the mouth of the pumpkin. And this one is pretty much done. So again, make sure your brush is nice and clean. We're going to dip into our white. And again, we're only going to use the tip of our brush. Just going to add in a few little areas to emphasize the shape of the pumpkin, just to make it look like there's more going on in our painting. Just make sure you keep dipping your brush in, that way your bristles will stay together. Add a few little tiny ones around the teeth if you'd like, just to make those pop forward. And that's pretty much it. If you need to, you can go back over any areas with a little bit of white again if they look a little too gray, if you really want that to have that high contrast. But I think I am done. I lie, I'm gonna add a little bit of white right here. Just a tiny bit for where it's going into the tree. There we go. So yeah, that's our first one. So I'm going to take just a really quick break and set up my next part of my canvas. And then I will be back to show you our other design.